Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the presence of the Laureate of 2016 Tang Prize in Rule of Law, Madam Louise Arbor, and our host, Professor Cheryl Saunders. Good afternoon, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to join us at the Laureate Lecture for 2016 Tang Prize in Rule of Law. To begin with, please welcome to the stage the host of this lecture session, Professor Cheryl Saunders, Laureate Professor Emeritus of Melbourne University, to give us the introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Professor Saunders.
Madam Louise Arbor, distinguished representatives of the Tang Prize, and ladies and gentlemen. Well, this afternoon marks the beginning of a very exciting few days. The award of the 2016 Tang Prizes, including the one that we note at this event now, the Tang Prize for the Rule of Law. The proceedings for these few days begin very appropriately with a lecture from the 2016 Tang Prize Laureate for the Rule of Law, Madame Louise Arbor. I'm honoured to have been asked to host this occasion, and so let me begin by introducing our lecturer. Louise Arbor has had a highly distinguished and varied career in the law. Amongst many roles, she has been a Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada, Canada's highest court, Chief Prosecutor to 2 international criminal tribunals, and that at a very early stage in the development of international criminal justice. She's been the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights at a critical stage in the evolution of that system, and she has been president of the International Crisis Group. In each of these roles, she's made a substantive contribution of her own to the rule of law, both nationally and internationally. So in this lecture, she draws on a lifetime of knowledge and wisdom working on and for the rule of law to suggest future paths for the promotion of the rule of law in the highly complex, often troubling world in which we live. I personally look forward to the lecture very much. Please welcome to the podium the Tang Prize Laureate for the Rule of Law, Madame Louise Arbor.
Thank you very much. I can see you. I hope you can see me. Thank you very much, Cheryl. And let me first express my gratitude to the Tang Foundation for giving me an opportunity to share with you today some of my reflections based on a lifetime of work in legal systems, both domestically in Canada and internationally, on the development of this important modern idea, the idea of the rule of law. The promotion of the rule of law is very much at the forefront of the international agenda. It is the centerpiece of many development initiatives interlinked with good governance and the fight against corruption, as well as with the growth of democratic practices. It is often advanced as an imperative in the broad field of conflict prevention, and it is invariably a component of peace negotiations. However, it is also often understood in its most restrictive acceptation, offering a common denominator for consensus, while in my view often betraying its most important and most useful characteristics. This is what I would like to develop in the course of my remarks today, in the hope of engaging a discussion with you on how best to advance a modern concept of the rule of law for the greater good. So let me first turn to this narrow understanding of the rule of law. The rule of law is often understood in a formal way, a somewhat superficial way, and it's in that context that actually it receives the least resistance. Viewed in that superficial way, the rule of law requires that governance be rooted in well-established norms and rules rather than in sheer human arbitrariness. This refers to a system of requirements that give a certain legitimacy to these rules. For example, the laws must have been properly enacted in accordance with norms and rules, some constitutional, some administrative, that ensure that the laws are not themselves arbitrary. For instance, the laws must be public. They must be non-retroactive and capable of compliance. They must have been, of course, enacted by proper authority, and they must be of general application. This is itself a subset of the principle that no one is above the law. There can be variations with regard to the procedural requirements for the validity of laws, but in general, the rule of law requires that laws present a credible alternative to arbitrariness and the capricious decisions of rulers. When these formalities have been complied with and the laws are validly enacted, some will suggest that the rule of law is fully in place. Understood that way, the rule of law is indifferent as to the content of these laws. In extreme cases, as well as the formalities have been put in place, the most repressive regimes can claim to operate in compliance with the rule of law. Justice Aaron Barak, former Chief Justice of Israel, gives a very compelling example of this, and I quote, "In this weak form, the rule of law exists even in a dictatorship. A friend once told me," said Justice Barak, "that during the Second World War, several Jews were in prison in Germany as a result of sentences that they received before the war broke out. The Gestapo did not harm these Jews because the law mandated that they not be exterminated in the death camps before finishing their prison sentences." So, and of course, in Nazi Germany, there was a sense that this rule of law had to be maintained. But when the prisoners finished their sentences, the Gestapo was waiting for them at the gate. The prisoners were taken to the death camps and murdered. The formal rule of law was observed. End of quote. But I suggest that in mature democracies and in states aspiring to the full benefits of the rule of law, a richer, more substantive understanding of that concept is required. That conception of the rule of law goes beyond the formal procedural requirement, and it proposes a set of principles and norms that inform the content of laws and not just their procedural validity. Some may argue that we now enter into the political field, that the content of laws is for the political body to decide and should not be predetermined by legal principles such as the rule of law. Yet, both international instruments and many domestic constitutions embrace this substantive understanding of the rule of law as an integral part of the features of democracy and good governance. The preamble to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, for example, provides as follows: whereas Canada is founded upon the principles that recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law. Very significantly, in my view, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights links the rule of law to peace, and I will return to that in more details below. Again, in the preamble to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we read the following: whereas it is essential, if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law. Understood that way, the rule of law compels not only that people be governed by laws that were properly enacted, but that these laws regulate appropriately the relationship between the state and the individual. The norms and principles that inform this substantive content of the rule of law can be found, for the most part, in human rights law. The rule of law does obviously not require an absolute consensus about the content of legislation. This in itself would be not only impossible, but would be an abdication of democratic principles under which dissent and opposition are welcome. Only in authoritarian states would dissent be suppressed and a pretend consensus be imposed. But the rule of law imports a minimum of content into legislation without which it would merely give a veneer of respectability to odious laws. Take, for example, the case of torture. There was a time where confessions were seen as the only reliable proof of guilt, and torture was perceived as the only reliable method of obtaining truthful confessions. Over time, however, torture came to be prohibited and is now absolutely prohibited under the widely ratified Convention Against Torture, as well as under international customary law and the laws of war. Even though torture is unfortunately still practiced today, it's always done in secret, which reflects the universal understanding of its illegality. The prohibition of torture is not simply a legislative choice reflecting the political preference in a given country. It is part and parcel of the rule of law. Let me illustrate that by the following example. In the course of the so-called war on terror, many allegations have been made that recourse to torture was taking place in large part, in the context of counterterrorism operations. And a lot of people argued that this was just simply inevitable. Professor Alan Dershowitz of Harvard University argued that since it was illusory to eradicate the use of torture, and since we knew that it was still widely practiced, it would be better to simply regulate the practice. He suggested that law enforcement personnel should have to apply to a judge in appropriate circumstances to obtain essentially a torture warrant. In his view, this would ensure that torture would only be used in the most extreme circumstances under judicial supervision. That way, he argued, the rule of law would prevail over secrecy and arbitrariness. Needless to say, I don't see even a modest superficial attraction to this argument. It is, in my view, a total perversion of the rule of law, reminiscent of the one described by Justice Barak, where Nazis made sure to follow all the rules before exterminating people. In both cases, the regulation of the activity obscures its repugnant character and gives it a veneer of legitimacy and legality. This attempt to enroll the law in the service of degrading, dehumanizing, and discriminatory practices is not an application of the rule of law, but it is an affront to the very concept. The rule of law embraces some substantive requirements, including the fundamental one that the state should be constrained not to infringe on the life and security of individuals and to provide all people with equal protection and equal benefit of the law without discrimination. Without substantive content, the rule of law becomes an empty shell, dangerously useful to provide an appearance of legitimacy to the most oppressive state practices. A purely formal procedural understanding of the rule of law provides order, but not justice. As a tool for domestic peace and prosperity, it is justice, not just order, that is required. The greatest driver of social unrest is injustice. Whether it takes the form of blatant discrimination, unavailability of reliable mechanisms of dispute resolution, gross inequalities and inequities, abuse of power by state officials, tolerated corruption, and the like, the rule of law would be of little assistance if it did not contain elements of justice rather than simply elements of order. This enriched understanding of the rule of law may be much more difficult to integrate on the international scene, both in development initiatives and in the promotion of so-called rules-based international order. So first, let me look at the development agenda. The UN Agenda for Development until 2030 has been produced under the label of Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 Sustainable Development Goals which are replacing the turn of the century Millennium Development Goals. Goal 16 is dedicated to the promotion of peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, the provision of access to justice for all, and building effective, accountable institutions at all levels. It's under this Goal 16 that one finds a reference to the rule of law in the following terms. Quote, "The rule of law and development have a significant interrelation and are mutually reinforcing, making it essential for sustainable development at the national and international level." In my view, Goal 10 is equally connected to the rule of law. It calls for the reduction of inequalities within and among countries, fiscal policies and social programs designed to share wealth more equitably and reach out to the most vulnerable are an integral part of a modern rule of law agenda. Many country leaders who purport to embrace the rule of law agenda will want to see it restricted to its procedural and institutional aspect, and they will resist that doctrine being used to impose substantive content to legislation, claiming that this would be an affront to state sovereignty. And yet, the international community, in my view, should be very wary of engaging in building rule of law capacity, essentially understood as law enforcement institutions such as police, courts, correctional facilities, oblivious to the content of the laws that are to be enforced. There is nothing to be gained in building the capacity of governments to exacerbate the sources of dissatisfaction and injustice in their country while reinforcing their repressive capacity. While conditionalities in development assistance have generated in recent years very well-deserved criticisms, maintaining a convenient ambiguity over the true meaning of the rule of law, in my view, is not an acceptable alternative. So rule of law initiatives should go hand in hand with the promotion and protection of human rights, since fundamental human rights and freedoms reflected in all major international instruments constitute, in my view, the core of the substantive rule of law. This difficulty is exacerbated by the tension between developing countries, the intended recipients of development assistance, and many Western countries, or the global North, most often and most visibly the providers of development aid. If the advancement of the rule of law overtly encompasses the promotion of human rights, old antagonisms may reemerge. Many developing countries have long been suspicious of the Western human rights agenda, claiming double standards when Western countries turn a blind eye to their own shortcomings while easily pointing fingers at them. It will therefore be critical to infuse rule of law initiatives with enough substantive content to avoid a total perversion of the promise for justice that the doctrine enshrines, while at the same time avoiding the perception of a covert program designed to undermine the sovereignty of recipient countries. The more is said about the rule of law, about what it entails, I think the better. This is not a proper environment for constructive ambiguity. The second challenge for the advancement of the rule of law internationally may be even more invidious. There is, I believe, an increasing appetite for what is often called a rules-based international order. Admittedly, it is difficult to mount a persuasive argument against such a concept, but the problem again is the following. What rules exactly are we talking about? Like the procedural understanding of the rule of law, this could be promoting only the idea that rules are better than chaos and arbitrariness. And of course, to some extent, this is true, but not all rules represent progress. So let me first examine the general idea of a rules-based international order, and I will then turn to a rule of law-based international order. So first, a rules-based international order. Without examining the content of the rules, I will simply look at the obvious desirability of ensuring that international governance be organized around a set of properly enacted rules, norms, standards, and that these be adequately complied with and enforced. Although this might seem self-evident, it is actually far from the situation today. There are many areas of multilateral state relations that are very poorly regulated, in large part due to the difficulty of obtaining the required consensus necessary for putting in place a treaty-based binding argument. I think the most blatant examples are in the field of climate change, where there is still no comprehensive international policy enshrined in binding convention to regulate the numerous initiatives that will be necessary to reduce global warming. In the same way, there is no comprehensive international agreement on migration-related issues. There is, of course, the 1948 Refugee Convention, but for all its important protective provisions regarding people fleeing political and other forms of persecution in their own countries, it is of very limited assistance to the growing phenomenon of economic migration, a term that often obscures a reality that should be best described in terms of survival migration. In an even more interconnected world, with communications and transport facilities even more accessible, and with inequalities of opportunity between countries not receding, the movement of people across borders is unlikely to slow down anytime soon. Yet, most non-refugee migration matters are left to bilateral arrangements and, of course, to the application of international human rights instruments, such as the Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers and Members of Their Family, a convention, unfortunately, notoriously poorly ratified, particularly among developed countries. We have also seen very little progress in international disarmament efforts and serious arm reduction initiatives. Now, these are mere examples of the numerous gaps in international governance that will need to be addressed if we are to seriously promote a rules-based international order. Equally important is the question of compliance and enforcement. Where rules are in place, compliance is to be expected, and deviance must be addressed by appropriate means. This is where international dispute mechanisms come into play. Most of the existing ones are established by treaties themselves, which created the obligations in the first place, and their enforcement capacity varies greatly. At the top of the pyramid, there is, of course, the system of international courts. First and foremost, the International Court of Justice, a principal organ of the United Nations, and the International Criminal Court, a relatively new jurisdiction also based in The Hague. Other venues, such as the Permanent Court of Arbitration, also provide important dispute settlement opportunities, as do a multiplicity of regional and other more private organizations, such as, for example, the International Chamber of Commerce. In all fields of law, where the rules receive broad public acceptance, compliance becomes the norm and enforced compliance the exception. But a total absence of enforcement capacity may foster a climate of cynicism and ultimately an erosion of the general acceptance of the norms. Therefore, we should be particularly alarmed at incidents where opinions or decisions by broadly accepted international institutions are ignored or openly defied. In such cases, the sanctions, if one can even refer to them as such, are purely political and often of minimal consequences. Indeed, since the creation of the International Criminal Tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, and the creation of the International Criminal Court, I believe that we have seen an increased awareness of the requirements of international humanitarian law, often referred to as the laws of war, and a greater degree of compliance in many armed forces, due in part to the existence of these accountability mechanisms and their helpful jurisprudence. Meanwhile, and particularly since 2001 and the beginning of the so-called war on terror, there has been an erosion of norms, or at least the introduction of considerable ambiguity in this field of international law. For one thing, there is at times uncertainty as to whether this body of law applies at all in a given situation, as there are differences of opinion as to what constitutes an armed conflict, such as to trigger its application. In the same way, the question of protection of civilians in armed conflict, which is at the heart of international humanitarian law, has come under stress as the distinctions between civilians and combatants has been blurred, in part by the emergence of non-state actors, rebels, insurgents, terrorists, who at times have the sympathy, if not the active support, of some parts of the population. This is linked, of course, to the question of the so-called collateral damage or the requirement of necessity and proportionality of response, which have also come under stress in recent years. Finally, in striking opposition to the rule of law, the term lawfare has emerged to describe essentially a form of propaganda by which one side may try to demonize its opponent by claiming abusive, illegal conduct on its part, thereby eroding public support. Nowhere more than in the field of armed conflict is a rules-based international order required. We should therefore strive to establish and improve clear doctrines, efficient monitoring mechanisms, and robust enforcement institutions as part of the management of international peace and security. Let me now turn briefly to the idea of a rule of law-based international order. I've already referred to the preamble of the Declaration of Human Rights, which I will remind you provides as follows. Whereas it is essential, if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law. This provides for the necessity to infuse substance into the rule of law. When people are no longer content to have governance regulated by properly enacted rules rather than by the mere whim of rulers, this rebellion against tyranny and oppression is likely, if not actually desirable, when laws don't protect fundamental human rights. I believe it's therefore imperative to turn to human rights law to import substantive requirements into the rule of law. This includes the fundamental and all-encompassing affirmation of equality of all men and women, born free in rights and dignity. It requires, above all, that all human beings receive the equal protection and equal benefit of the law without discrimination. It also requires that all laws respect the fundamental human rights and freedoms that are at the core of human fulfillment: freedom of conscience, religion, assembly, and the like. There's no need to expand here on the well-established field of human rights. Most of it is now enshrined in widely ratified international instruments. Properly understood, this includes a vast array of both civil and political rights, as well as economic, social, and cultural rights, with special articulation of these rights for different groups, such as women, children, indigenous peoples, migrants, refugees, people with disabilities, and others. The advocacy of the rule of law must therefore encompass advocacy of human rights protection and promotion. Without it, the rule of law is impoverished, and with it, both development and security interests are advanced. The Sustainable Development Goals, to which I've referred earlier, that were enacted as part of the UN Development Agenda for 2013, have articulated these 17 goals that the world should strive to put in place and develop for the next 15 years. Goal 16 is often referred to as the main and true rule of law goal. It calls for the promotion of peaceful and inclusive societies, access to justice for all, and accountable and inclusive institutions. Many of the other SDGs, some of which I've referred to earlier, are actually expressions of fundamental human rights, and in that way should be viewed as part of the rule of law agenda. End poverty, end hunger, provide for healthy lives and quality education for all. All these are economic and social rights enshrined in international covenants. I see considerable progress in articulating the promotion of human rights as part of the world's development agenda. It is imperative that this be recognized as such, that these are fundamental rights belonging to all people on earth, not just policy choices that could be abandoned in favor of other policy priorities. The rule of law is as intrinsic to development as it is to security. It is, however, most often construed as responding mostly to security concerns and is often resorted to in order to advance the interest of repression. This, I suggest to you in conclusion, must be resisted with the greatest clarity and firmness. So let me just conclude with the following thought. In an era where lawmakers are confronted with the difficult balance between our security and our liberty interests, both at the national and international level, they will be well advised to remember the word of the late Herbert Packer, an American scholar whose work in the late 60s was hugely influential in my own thinking about criminal law. If there is a discipline where abuse of power is always to be kept in check, and where security and liberty interests often clash, it is very much in the field of criminal law. This branch of public law governs the ultimate power of the state to regulate the most fundamental aspects of human conduct under the threat of punishment of the most severe nature. As Packer put out in his 1968 book entitled The Limits of the Criminal Sanction, and I will leave you with this quote from Packer: "Law, including the criminal law, must, in a free society, be judged ultimately on the basis of its success in promoting human autonomy and the capacity for individual human growth and development. The prevention of crime is an essential aspect of the environmental protection required if autonomy is to flourish. It is, however, a negative aspect, and one which, if pursued with single-minded zeal, may end up creating an environment in which all are safe, but none is free." Thank you very much. I would be very happy to take some of your questions, if you have any, or to engage in a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Madame Arbor for the lecture. We will now proceed to the Q&A session. We have actually received quite a few questions from the floor already. And now coordinator of Tang Prize Foundation, Mr. Raymond Song, will help read these questions. Let's now hand the floor to Mr. Song.
Thank you. I'm extremely honored to be the reporter or the announcer of the excellent questions collected from the audience. The first question is from Mr. Lin Zhengwei, who asks that how do we enforce and how do we ensure the compliance to the rule of law in time of armed conflicts? For example, as we see in the civil war in Syria, where the ISIS was very active, or under some military regimes in, for example, Africa or in Latin America, or as North America. So what's your observations about ensuring the compliance to the rule of law in times of war or armed conflict?
Thank you. This is a very challenging question. Institutionally, this, in fact, is within the ambit of the role of the Security Council of the United Nations, the ultimate coercive authority in world affairs. As has been pointed out, not only by scholars, but by many in the political field as well, the Security Council is now perceived as having an eroded credibility, in large part because of its composition. It is an institution, it's the institution that is empowered to maintain international peace and security, and as I said, that also has coercive powers, including the power to legally provide for military intervention under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. So this is the ultimate body that is charged with compliance of the law of armed conflict. Two things. The first thing is, in the early 1990s, it acted, the Security Council, with unprecedented imagination, foresight, and courage, to some extent, in creating the two international criminal tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and for Rwanda. This was, I think, for the first time in its history, that the Council added a tool to its otherwise quite limited toolbox of interventions. Its toolbox essentially consists of statements and declarations denouncing practices, encouraging states to behave a certain way. These are basically a political tool of not coercion, but encouragement for compliance. When that fails, the Council can turn to more robust forms of enforced compliance, particularly through the use of sanctions. Now, these have mixed results and very often unintended, undesirable consequences, as they put at times an undue burden on a population without triggering the kind of regime response that the sanctions are there to compel. And of course, ultimately, the Security Council could compel a military intervention, as, for instance, was called for in the case of the war in Syria. In the early days of the civil uprising, there were calls from different sources all over the world for the Security Council to actually command or encourage or authorize, at a minimum, the same kind of intervention that it did authorize in the case of Libya. I think, unfortunately, one can now question, in retrospect, whether the military intervention in Libya produced the desirable consequences of a peaceful, reconciled country emerging with the growth of democratic institutions. It seems to be very far from the case. So this is currently what is at our disposal. We have a Security Council, as you know, that is at times completely paralyzed with conflicting agendas that we thought were behind us after the end of the Cold War, but have been, I think, resuscitated in recent years. So we have considerable paralysis in this one institution. But the Council came together in the 1990s to create international criminal justice, an instrument for legal compliance, in this case with the law of war, by turning to the idea of personal criminal responsibility of leaders, political and military leaders, as high up in the chain of command as one can reach, to visit responsibility for what are now referred to as mass atrocities, war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide. This was an incredibly progressive initiative on the part of the Security Council, and it led eventually to the creation of the Rome Statute, which then created a permanent institution, the International Criminal Court. I think 20 years after this innovative gesture on the part of the Council, we are now, I think, at a somewhat low point in the unfolding of this justice enterprise. There's been considerable pushback, in particular by several African leaders who were targeted by the court. There's a deficiency, I think, in the current formula, in that the International Criminal Court only has jurisdiction over states that have ratified the Rome Statute, and unfortunately, this currently does not include many big, powerful countries, and frankly, many countries that are currently the theater of war. Sudan, for instance, where there was desperation at the situation in Darfur and a claim of impotence of the international community. So we have very imperfect institutions at this stage, a Security Council with the 5 permanent members having a veto and no longer representing, I think, the configuration of the world's population. So we have institutions that are tired and in need of a renewal that's very difficult to achieve. And as I said, we have doctrines, including the rule of law, that have yet, I think, to deliver on their full potential. And frankly, I think in the end, we also have leadership that in recent years has been not as inspiring as one would like to see in times where so much is at stake for the renewal of global governance.
Thank you. The second question brings us from the war during the armed conflict to the time post-armed conflicts. What's your view about the difficulties in achieving transitional justice, especially in the populations where different groups have different interpretation of the histories? Is the international pursuit of criminal justice a part to play a role in facilitating achieving of transitional justice after the conflicts?
Well, let me say a few things. Again, the very idea of transitional justice, which is a very rich concept that includes, on the one hand, these tribunals, so an idea of personal accountability, very much based on the concept that if leaders are made personally accountable, it will, in a sense, diffuse the targeting of entire populations as having been responsible for atrocity. So the whole idea is to break the cycle of revenge. It ranges, therefore, from accountability to all kinds of mechanisms like truth and reconciliation commissions, guarantees of non-repetition, forms of compensation. I, for one, think that models that look not only to the past but also to the future are important initiatives. Frankly, I think normally I'm not the one to advocate patience, but justice and justice systems take a long time to develop and to evolve. Just putting in place a set of rules is only a step. You need a profound cultural acceptance of the ideas that are being promoted by these justice initiatives. I think we're going to see South Africa is very often referred to as a model that chose, rather than the kind of personal criminal responsibility model, that chose a model of truth and reconciliation. And frankly, I think it's going to take a long view of the history of South Africa, projecting farther into the future, to be able to measure the full extent to which it can be said that that choice genuinely was the root of a profound reconciliation in the country. One can hope so. There are certainly signals. It's a country that didn't break out into civil war immediately after the collapse of the apartheid regime. It may very well end up being a fully successful story, which doesn't make it necessarily always exportable. Not all countries have a Nelson Mandela at their leadership when critical times come to make these kinds of choices. Not all countries have a judicial system and an intellectual leadership in the field of justice to move their country in that direction. And frankly, I would say today the one place we should look at is Colombia. The government of Colombia just recently signed a peace accord with the FARC. This is the longest armed conflict in the Latin American continent, and this is the first time ever that a peace agreement includes the full spectrum of transitional justice mechanisms, ranging from, again, acceptance of responsibility, truth-telling, memorials, some forms of reparation, particularly in the form of government expenditures in rural areas that were particularly affected by the conflict, and personal criminal accountability. This was not the case in the former Yugoslavia. This was not the case in Rwanda. All this was imposed from the outside. So I think the Colombia model will be one that we will be wise, first of all, to support, but also to look at as sort of an important lesson moving forward.
A related question is about the humanitarian concerns, especially with relation to refugees in time of armed conflicts. Example is posted by Professor Lee from Shixing University, who says UN Secretary of State John Kerry appealed in the UN yesterday for international joint efforts to help solve the issue of Syrian refugees. How can the rule of law be applied to help solve this current refugee crisis today, so as to protect the Syrians' human rights?
Well, frankly, I think that what we see, this is an area where there is an international law framework, the Refugee Convention. And this is not, we are not at a time where, in particular, Western countries are covering themselves with glory in discharging their international obligations. And frankly, I would not put all the burden on the countries that are at the border of the influx of this population in need. The spirit of the Refugee Convention is also a spirit of international cooperation. It's really important for countries like Canada, which I think at least has made a serious effort by taking more than 30,000 Syrian refugees. It's incumbent on all countries to step forward in solidarity with the countries that are at the front line of the obligation to receive asylum seekers. And frankly, when we look at the flow of Syrian populations into Jordan, into Lebanon, into Turkey, and the effort in some European countries, certainly the countries at the border, where refugees could actually enter by sea or by land, and the resistance of countries that have the luxury of resettlement, the luxury of screening refugees appropriately before taking them in on a resettlement program. I don't think that we collectively have much to celebrate. In fact, if countries with as much capacity as the countries of Europe and generally of the Western world are incapable of facing this kind of challenge, the proportions, even though the numbers seem very large, in proportion of the population of Europe and North America, we are still talking about a capacity frankly, for wealth sharing that I think is implicit in the obligations we undertook at the end of the Second World War. The very ugly rhetoric of resistance to the discharge of these obligations, I think, is appalling. And it's frankly, it's language we hear every time there's an influx of a particular group of people in need. There's always suspicion, that they will undermine the democratic fabric of our societies. This comes time and again, and yet, certainly if I take the example of Canada, our history is a history of immigrants and of refugees who have come to our shore, have contributed to the making of a pluralistic, inclusive society, not perfect, but certainly no wave of immigrants or refugees have delivered the apocalypse that was being predicted when they were entering our shores in great numbers. So this is an area where I think we have an adequate framework under the Refugee Convention, but a very mediocre global response. And then, since I'm in Asia, I think we could talk about regional migration, economic migrants and political asylum seekers. In this region, I think we also need to see regional cooperation, and I hate the expression of burden sharing because it presumes that taking in people in need is a burden. It may seem to be a burden in the short term, but soon after their arrival, these people find work, they pay taxes, and in the end, in the medium to longer term, they've always proven to be a great asset to their country of asylum. So I think those who believe in the substance of these international obligations should speak up against the very loud voice of those who are pushing back against these important principles of solidarity.
Due to time restraint, I have one small last question for you because it's from a great admirer of you, so I have to read this. A professor from Zhenji University, Professor Ong, who asked about also I have two questions about the effectiveness of UN human rights regime, about whether compliance of the human rights norm, especially from powerful states, can be ensured. And Professor Ong's question referred to the consolidation of the supernatural supervision and implementation system under the UN human rights system. What's your thought about the reform or making the UN human rights system better?
Well, let me first talk about the growth of human rights protection in many countries domestically, and then maybe I'll address the international aspect. In Canada, we enacted a constitutionally enshrined Bill of Rights, essentially the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom, in 1982. Prior to that, we had a Bill of Rights that did not have constitutional status. It was only one piece of legislation. Due in large part, I think, to the quality of the legal profession and of the judiciary, particularly of the judiciary. Most judges who were sitting on the bench in 1982 had been educated under a system, frankly, of considerable judicial restraint and deference to legislators. The Charter imposed a burden of judicial review on judges, and to their credit, I think Canadian judges adapted to this form of constitutional dialogue with Parliament, and very appropriately, some may say courageously, some who are less fans of judicial power will say in a form of improper activism, they took their proper place in the protection and promotion of fundamental rights and freedoms by striking down legislation, very often in fields of considerable social controversy. But for the most part, overwhelmingly, Canadians respect the courts, particularly the Supreme Court of Canada. I can say that I'm not a member of the court anymore, so I don't have a conflict of interest in praising this institution. But I believe that the court has the respect of Canadians, even when some people disagree profoundly with the result of the decision. They believe that these are principled decisions guided by constitutional requirements, legal analysis, the discourse in the court, the debate, even when the confrontation of ideas is intellectually very robust. It is always respectful, and the decisions of the court are overwhelmingly, in times, not only fully supported, but become fully part of the fabric of Canadian societies. And this goes for topics that certainly in 1992, we were a long way, for instance, from embracing the idea of gay marriage, which is now constitutionally guaranteed in Canada. This has been part of an evolution of the idea of the protection of vulnerable minorities, often unpopular minorities, that a mature democratic system is not functioning solely by the tyranny of the majority, that constitutional protection for fundamental rights that go to a person's core identity have to be protected by law. Now, if I transpose that to the international scene, for one thing, I should say there has been progress, I think, in the idea of what are human rights, why is it important for states to comply with their international human rights obligations, but there's no equivalent. There is no international human rights court to lift the language that we hear in the Human Rights Council, which is an quintessentially political body, where the discourse is not grounded in principles, in human rights principles. It's, I think, grounded in the promotion, more often the promotion of state interest than the promotion of the individual interest reflected by human rights law. Now, we have regional courts, unfortunately not in Asia, but in Europe, in Latin America, very robust, and in Africa, not fully operational yet, but we have regional bodies. So if countries, if the national leadership in a country is not ready to put in place a robust judicial system to protect fundamental rights, the next step for enforcement is having a regional court, such as the European Court of Human Rights or the Latin American courts, that have proven it's the neighborhood. You know, it's much more credible to have a voice in the neighborhood, and one can only hope that we'll see, if not through ASEAN, but through some other initiative, regional or sub-regional initiatives in Asia that would be a step above national protection of human rights. Internationally, we have treaty bodies, but they're, in my view, their work is not very well known, certainly not in public opinion, and therefore their capacity not to coerce compliance, but even to influence the culture of respect for human rights is obviously not as strong as a court would be. So I don't see that over the horizon, certainly in the near future or maybe in my lifetime, but on the other hand, I never thought in my lifetime that I would see the creation of international criminal justice, and it's now 20 years old, and if not going strong, it's still going and very promising. So I'm an optimist. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Arbor. And now we would like to invite Professor Saunders back to the stage for the closing remarks.
Well, we have just listened to a fascinating, deceptively simple, and deeply knowledgeable lecture offering an array of insights that will repay more careful study. And if anything, I thought that those answers to the questions were as interesting and as rich as the lecture itself. Very importantly, for present purposes, Madame Arbor has offered us a clear and robust vision for the future of the rule of law. Necessarily, for our times, she's canvassed the rule of law at both the national and international levels, and of course, as she's explained, those two are closely linked. For both, she calls for what is sometimes called the thick rule of law, embracing a range of human rights in the interests of justice. And I have no doubt at all that that is the vision of the rule of law shared by the Tang Prize Foundation. The lecture advocates precise directions for action at both national and international levels in order to advance a meaningful rule of law. And in doing so, it also takes into account a range of the critical issues for the rule of law that characterize our times. The responses to the war on terror, the extreme inequality of peoples within states and between states, the tragedy of people flows across national borders, a tragedy that will be exacerbated as climate change begins to bite. In many ways, the lecture we've just heard offers us all a challenge. The vision is clear, but putting it into operation is another matter. There is a great deal to do, and the high importance of having a Tang Prize for the rule of law needs to be considered from that perspective. Will you please join with me in thanking our lecturer for such a wonderful presentation this evening.
Thank you very much. Please kindly remain on the stage because we will now invite our guest of honors to step on the stage for a group photo shoot to remember this very special event. Thank you very much. Thank you for the very inspiring lecture given to us this afternoon. And ladies and gentlemen, this is the end of the Rule of Law lecture. Thank you very much for your participation. 各位来宾，第二届唐奖得奖人演讲法制场到这边圆满结束，非常感谢您今天的参与。离场的时候，请记得将您的同步口译接收器归还到原先您所租借的服务区，并且记得要携带您随身携带的物品。谢谢，祝您有个美好的夜晚。